for joining us today here at Cornerstone Church. We are a church that loves God and loves others. If you have any questions or would like to find out more, check us out online at bethaltochurch.com. We'd also love to connect with you in person. Cornerstone Church meets every Sunday morning at 10:10 in Bethalto, Illinois. We look forward to seeing you. And now, onto the message.
Growing up, I was a pretty good reader. I like to read. I read all sorts of different, series of books, but there was one particular type of book that I ran into that I really loved, and it probably was not, the deepest kind of reading, but it was these books. I wonder if anybody else remembers them. They were called Choose Your Own Adventure books. Yes, Nikki remembers those books. Anybody remember these? Raise your hands. I want to see who knows these books. Okay. Wow. So many of you missed out on the Choose Your Own Adventure books. These were amazing. They were written in the second person. I think we have a picture of some of the covers. These books were written in the second person, so it was written as though you were like the main character of the story. And what happened was, there were all sorts of different themes. Like, there was like maybe one that was about being in space, or there was one that you were on a treasure hunt, or there was a mystery that you needed to have solved. And what would happen is, you would read through the first couple of pages, and then like 3 or 4 pages in, at the bottom, there would be a choice. And you got to pick how the story progressed. So for instance, say the story brought you to a house, you had knocked on the door, and no one was answering the door. At the bottom of the page, it would say, if you want to kick the door in, go to page 28. If you want to go around back and look for another way in, go to page 40, okay? So then you had this like decision, what am I going to do? So you'd pick that, and then you'd go and you read a couple more pages, and then you have another choice, and it would lead you down. So I loved these books because every time you read it, you could have a different experience. One of the things I realized after a while, though, is that these books really only had one good ending. The rest were all really, really bad. You die, or you get lost, and something bad would happen, or it just wasn't satisfying. And so, on the really hard books, what I would do is I would flip through and find the right ending, and then I would try to reverse engineer the story so I could figure out how to get the right ending and experience it. So here's the thing. I think sometimes in life, we view life kind of like a Choose Your Own Adventure book. There are so many choices, there are so many decisions that we have to make all throughout life, and sometimes we're left wondering, is this going to lead me down to the right ending, or am I somehow jeopardizing my future because I'm making the wrong choice here? We've been taking a look at the New Testament letter to the people in Colossae the last several weeks. It's the New Testament letter called Colossians, and in this letter, the Apostle Paul is writing to a group of believers around the year 60, AD 60. And he's writing to a group of people that he doesn't know, and he's talking about a variety of different things. In a few weeks, he's going to start addressing some false teaching that has crept into the church there. But today, Paul talks about God's will. God talks about God's plan, His purpose for our life. And so let's just jump right in and let's take a look at what he says here at the beginning of verse 9. He says, for this reason. Now, for this reason, remember last time we talked in verse 8, he talked about the gospel coming to them, how they were growing. The gospel was bearing fruit in their lives. And he says, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. Remember, we've already mentioned this too a couple of times. Paul is someone who prays, and he prays on a regular basis. In fact, what Paul is doing here is he's modeling what he's going to tell the Colossians in the next verse to do. Goes on in the second part of verse 9, he says, we continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of His will. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of His will. So there's a couple of basic ideas here. There is a God, He has a plan, and you can know that plan. That seems like it's very simple, but that's very profound. Church, I want you to recognize something. God has a plan. He has a plan for your life, and what's more, you can know it. You can know it. And Paul's prayer for the believers is that God would fill the believers with the knowledge of his will. There are several phrases that parents tend to say, and I'm sure Dylan and Kelsey, you'll get your experience at saying some of these phrases. But there's one phrase, I don't know that Bethany and I have said this recently, or at least I don't remember saying it in the last couple of years, but there's a 4-word phrase that I think strikes fear into the heart of every child. And it usually comes at a moment in a conversation with your child where the parent is exasperated, kind of at their end, and it's kind of the nuclear option for parents. It's because I... Yes, you got it. Because I said so, right? There's that point in a conversation, discussion, argument, whatever you would call it, with your child where you're like, I don't care, just do it because I said so, right? And then there's not much else at that point that you can appeal to as a child at that point, except for maybe it's not fair. And then the next line is, life isn't fair. Yeah, see, you are good parents. Or we're all really bad parents. I don't know which. But we all at least are on the same page. So we have this expression, because I said so. And here's the thing. I know what's good for my kids. Like when I tell them to go to bed, I know it's because they need to get rest so they can be healthy and they can grow. Because I said so, go to bed. When I tell them to brush their teeth, because I said so, it's because I know they need to have good hygiene. When I tell them to eat fruits and vegetables, it's because they need the nutrients and they need to be healthy. They need a healthy diet. And I know, and my reasoning is good, it's sound. And in the same way, God has every right to say to us, because I said so. He knows more than we do. He created us. He knows the inner workings of our mind, body, and spirit. And so God has every right to say so. But here's the thing. God gives us a choice. There are 2 different kinds of people in this world. There are people who say to God, thy will be done, and there are people who say to God, my will be done. It really comes down to that. You're either going to be someone that says to God, thy will be done, or you're saying, my will be done. You can either accept it or reject it. Now, Paul prays that these believers would know God's will because he wants them to accept God's will. He wants them to live it out. Now, on the one hand, when we talk about God's will, we're talking about actions and choices that we make. But I think oftentimes, some of us, that's all we think about when we talk about God's will, is actions and choices that we make. And usually we do this around a few kind of big decisions in life. So we've got some students in the room here today. Some of you are in high school, and you're beginning to ask these questions. God, what is your will for my life? God, what college should I go to? What career path should I choose? Maybe some of you are in a different stage of your life, and maybe you're asking the question, should I get married? Who should I marry? Should I have children? How many children should I have? What do I do about my career now? I've got an opportunity over here. Should I take that job opportunity? And we kind of relegate God's will to a few different areas like this. And this is important. We need to ask God about these big issues of our life. These are important decisions, but I think if we're not careful, we end up thinking of these decisions like we do a choose-your-own-adventure book. That if we pick the wrong one, we're somehow careened towards the bad ending, or we've jeopardized God's plan for our life. But God's will is bigger than that. So let me illustrate it this way. We ask for God's will in these big issues, but we don't ask necessarily for God's will in all the issues. So you might ask God, to speak to you or to help you understand what his will is for your job. But how many of you got up today and looked in the closet and prayed that God would show you his will for what clothes you need to wear, right? Like, no, you didn't. Some of you, if you did, you need to go back and listen to Jesus, all right? So that's a different issue for a different story and a different sermon. But you know what it is? But you don't do that. Why? Because you understand that's not an important issue. So where's the line? Where's the line? Some of us, we view God's will like this choose-your-own-adventure, or maybe sometimes we view God's will like a bullseye of a target. Like, we better hit that bullseye, and if we don't, we're going to fall short and everything is sunk. The story of our life is going to be ruined. I don't think that that's helpful to view God's will in that way. I mean, certainly there are things that God wants us to do, but I don't think it's helpful for us to get so worried about the particulars. I think it's more helpful for us to view the whole target as God's will, or even better, a direction or a trajectory of our life. I think God's oftentimes, We ask, God, should I do this or this? And God says, yes. And here's the reason why. Because God's will does have to do with our actions and our choices, but God's will also has to do with who we are. You see, being filled with the knowledge of God's will means understanding what we are called to do and who He has called us to be. See, God's will or God's plan is concerned with what you will do, but it's also concerned with who you will be. God's not just concerned about rote actions or choices that we make. He wants us to become more and more like Him. So let me ask you that question today. Who are you becoming? Who are you becoming? Are you becoming who God wants you to be? Are you becoming more like Jesus? Or are you becoming less like Him? Now, some of us in the room, you are planners. You have planned out every hour of your week this week. You know what you're going to eat. You've got all the meals planned out. You know exactly how you're going to spend your money. You know exactly where your time is going to be spent. You've got everything figured out to the T. You know what you want to accomplish and when and how you want to accomplish it. But let me ask you, have you submitted those plans to God? Or are you simply saying, God, this is my will for this week? Have you stopped and considered what God wants you to do? Are your plans crowding out God's plans? Now, some of you are just the opposite. Some of you are the kind of people where you just let life hit you. I mean, the wind blows and you are gone, right? Because you just do whatever. You float around and whatever happens, happens. You let life happen to you. But you need to ask, what expectations does God have for you? Have you been ignoring, whether innocently or not, intentionally or not, have you been ignoring the fact that God has a purpose and a plan for your life? Church, God has given each of you, wonderful gifts and talents that you are called to steward. God has given you gifts and talents and responsibilities that He's called you to steward. And how are you using those resources for His glory? God's called you to a task. Are you even taking time to stop and think about it? My prayer for the last several weeks as I've been looking at this passage is that we as a church would take time to recognize the fact that God has a plan for us. And when I say that, sometimes when I feel like when I say that phrase, God has a plan for you, I think some of us go, oh yeah, there's a plan out there. No, God has a specific plan for your life. For your life. There are things that God wants to accomplish in you and who you are becoming, and He wants you to accomplish things that you are to do with your life as well. Who are you becoming? Are you listening? Are you responding to that? So how do we know God's will? How do we respond to this? It says at the end of verse 9, we continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of His will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. Through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. The knowledge of God's will is something that the Spirit has to give to us. God fills us. It's not something that we earn. It's not something that, it's not a mental exercise that we go through, that it's like head knowledge of some sort. If you want to know God's will, then you have to know God's heart. It doesn't just happen on its own. It takes devotion. It takes communion with Him. 2 weeks ago, we talked about different spiritual disciplines that we need to participate in if we're going to grow in our relationship with God. I'm not going to repeat that today, but I'm going to say that we need to consistently put ourselves in an environment where we can hear and be filled with knowledge of God's will. This needs to happen to us individually. Each of us on our own need to take time away and spend time with God and hear from Him. Hear what He wants to say to us. If you have to lock yourself away from the rest of your family, do it. If you have to get up early and you're not a morning person, then do it. Do whatever it takes to get yourself away from the distractions and listen to God's voice and to hear what He's called you to do. If you have to rearrange your schedule, do it. Do whatever it takes. Take time to meet with Jesus daily. Set yourself apart for Him. There's a fancy religious word that we use, or a theological word that we use. It's the word consecrate. We need to consecrate ourselves to God. We set ourselves apart and we say, God, I am yours. God, it's not my will, but God, it's your will, and I want to follow what you have told me to do with my life. And the way you hear that, the way you know that, is by listening and communing with the Spirit and allowing Him to speak with you. We need to ask God, what's your will? How am I going to use my gifts and talents? How am I going to use my resources? How do I need to steward my life and live my life for your glory? So that happens personally, but it also needs to happen corporately as well. At the end of our service, we provide time for you to respond. And I always kind of jokingly say that it's a time for our congregation to multitask, because we sing a couple of songs and we have our prayer team come forward, and you can come forward for prayer. You can also come forward and kneel here at these stairs, or you can, if there's a need or an issue you want to talk to with somebody else in the congregation, you can do that too. But I really want to take time. It's been on my heart the last couple of weeks just to talk about one aspect of that. And it's the time where I encourage people to come forward just to pray at the stairs here. Traditionally, we call this area of our church the altar. And I know different churches have different setups, and there's little kneelers and different things in other churches. But basically, this kind of area of a church is called the altar. Now, an altar is not just a word that we use for churches. I mean, that comes from the altar where you would sacrifice animals. An altar is a place where something dies. And so at the end of our service, can I encourage you on a regular basis to make time to spend here at the altar, where you come forward and you die to your desires, you die to your wants, you die to yourself, and you say, Christ, I'm yours. We just heard a message, and I'm going to listen now and make an altar here, and I'm going to respond. I'm going to bow down. I'm going to kneel down before you, God, and I'm going to submit myself. I'm going to set myself apart, and I'm going to ask you, God, what would you want me to do with the message that I just heard today? Or maybe there's a specific thing going on in your life, and you just say, God, what is it that you're calling me to do in this situation? Church, we need to have times where we do this. Now I realize that there's a variety of people in the room. Some of you in the room, you might say, well, I'm super holy, and I don't need to go to the altar. Okay, first of all, you got problems if you think that. But the reality is, okay, let's assume that person exists. You coming forward and spending time kneeling at the altar, what it does is it visually helps other people in the room to see what's an appropriate way to respond to God's word is. You can disciple other people by your obedience and coming forward and praying in that way. That's a great way for you to lead by example. And nothing is going to harm you if you come forward. It's not going to hurt your faith to come forward and spend some time at the altar and pray. Church, we need to spend time at the altar individually, but we also as a church need to come together. Look, my commitment to you as the pastors of this church is that we are going to have times around the altar where we listen to hear what God is saying to us, and we're going to go then and do his will. I don't want to just do church. I want to do God's will. And I want to do the things that God has called us to do. And so I need to do that individually in my life, but I also need to do that corporately. You need to do that individually to determine what God's will is, but we also need to do this corporately as well. So today, I'm going to challenge you to come forward, spend a couple minutes, spending time, dying to yourself, coming here at the altar and seeking God for his will. There's something meaningful about moving where you are. A change of place and a change will give you a change of perspective, I think. Changing your position and changing your place can give you a different perspective. So why do we do all this? Is it just so that we can get the good ending at the end of the story? No. There's a reason for this. Paul tells us at the beginning of verse 10, we do this so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way. So that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way. That word live that's translated there is a Greek word that means to walk or to go about or to behave. So it's not just living, it's the actions that you do in your everyday life. So knowing God's will isn't just an exercise in head knowledge. Knowing God's will should lead to doing God's will. Pay attention to the focus on here. The focus is on Jesus, it's not on us. Paul doesn't say that you will live a life for yourself so that you will be pleased in every way, does he? No, he says live a life worthy of God so that you will please him in every way. The purpose of following God's will is not for our own self-actualization or our own fulfillment. Though I do believe that you will find fulfillment in doing it, that's not the purpose. We don't follow God's will for our sake, we follow for his sake. Last week we had a missionary here, Jeremy Skinner, missionary to Indonesia. And at the end of that time, whenever we have a missionary in, we encourage you to give financially to the missionary that's here. And let me just say, I am always blown away by your generosity. Thank you for supporting missionaries like the Skinners. It's just incredible to me how generous you are. But last week, I really felt impressed to take a minute and to challenge us to think beyond just giving money, because in some ways, it's relatively easy to just give money. I really felt like maybe the Lord was speaking to some of us, calling us to do our part to go, not just to give and not just to send, but that perhaps God was speaking to somebody here about their calling to go to the mission field or to wherever it is. And so I'm sure that in the room last week when I said that, there were people that responded and said, oh, you know what, I'm going to pray about that. I'm going to consider that. But I'm sure there were people in the room that kind of scoffed at that idea too. I'm sure there were people that just said, Pastor Eric, I'm just too old for that. Or Pastor Eric, I don't know enough yet. I've not been a Christian long enough. Or Pastor Eric, there's things in my life that I got to get figured out first. Or Pastor Eric, there's no way. I've got a job, I got a family, and I got all these responsibilities. But church, God's will isn't about your comfort. God's will isn't about how easy you perceive it to be. Look, if you're a Christian, you are called a disciple or a follower of Jesus. Now, you're following Jesus. Let's look at Jesus' life and the Gospels. Where did Jesus go? He went to the cross. His life here on earth was focused and aimed at and directed towards suffering on the cross. That's what it was all about. That's what we're going to do on Good Friday, this Friday. We're going to look at the cross. We're going to look at the suffering. We're going to look at the sacrifice that was made for us. And I just have to say, if I can just be honest, if your life is not marked with any kind of sacrifice, you have to ask yourself, am I following Jesus? Serious. If your life has no amount of sacrifice in it, then you have to ask, am I following Jesus? If your life is so focused on yourself and your needs and your wants, are you even following Jesus at all? If you only serve yourself, if you're only concerned with yourself, if you're only taking, if you're only receiving, you know what they called it? They called it a leech. Don't be a leech. Jesus wasn't a leech. He didn't come here and say, I'm Jesus, serve me. No, he says in Philippians 2 that, or actually it says in Mark, that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In Philippians 2, it says he emptied himself. He let go of all of his rights to be divine. And he said, no, I'm here to humble myself and to serve, to live the life of a servant, and humble myself even to death on the cross. And so we need to evaluate ourselves. If we're following God, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy. This is not a fun thing for us to talk about, but I want to challenge us, because I think sometimes in our American Christianity, we get this idea that God just wants us to be happy and got a lot of money and, fulfilled in all these different ways. And I do think that there's fulfillment, but sometimes that fulfillment is found when you embrace the cross. My wife has been reading a book by missionary Elizabeth Elliot. Jim Elliot is one of my heroes. Jim Elliot was Elizabeth Elliot's husband. They went and they were ministering to a tribe of people, and one of their first encounters, this people that they were missionaries to, they were trying to reach with the gospel. One of their first encounters, this tribe of people came out and they killed her husband. He was martyred for his faith. And there's a beautiful story that happened after that where the villagers understood the gospel after that and they came to faith. But Elizabeth Elliot went on and she got married again after that. And if I remember correctly, that husband developed cancer and he died. And my wife has been reading this book. She found it on my shelf the other day. And what's the name of it? Can you put that first slide up? I don't have it in my notes. A Lamp Into My Feet. It's by Elizabeth Elliot. This is several slides, but I want to read because it goes in line with what we're talking about. It says, to be transformed into the image of Christ, I must learn his character, love his obedience to the will of the Father, and begin step by step to walk the same pathway. For Christ, the pathway to obedience began with emptying himself. I must begin at the same place. What does this mean? Is it mere words? How can one leave self behind and make himself nothing? The answer will not come in a vacuum. If a man or woman honestly wishes to be a follower, the opportunity will present itself. Christ will say, here's your chance. Now in this situation, you must make a choice. Will it be self, or will you choose me? Thy will or my will? An older missionary said something to Amy Carmichael when she was a younger missionary that stayed with her for life. She had spoken of something which was not to her liking. His reply was, see in it a chance to die. That last sentence has haunted me for the last several days since my wife said it. See in it a chance to die. What if in doing that hard thing that God has called you to do, it's a chance to die? I wonder if some of us avoid asking God what his purpose and plan, big picture is for our life because we don't want the discomfort of dying in the process to ourselves, into our wants, into the nice things we have, to our family. I'm not talking about being careless or running into abuse or pain. I'm not talking about being irresponsible or foolish. I'm talking about listening to the still small voice of God and stepping out in faithful obedience. I believe that there are people in the room who may be called to do something different than what they're doing with their life right now. It might be ministry, it might be another job, it might be any number of things, but some of us are too afraid to ask the question and to listen and to be honest with what God's speaking to us because we don't want to see it as a chance to die. Instead, we want to see it as too painful or too difficult, and so I'm not gonna do that. For most of us, if it's painful, if it's bad. If it's inconvenient, I'm avoiding it. If it's uncomfortable, I don't want anything to do with it. But sometimes the way of Jesus are those very things. Sometimes the way of Jesus, following his will, means we abandon things that our world's values and we cling to the things that are of God. Now, in the next several verses, what Paul's going to do is he's going to lay out 3 different characteristics of those who are in God's will. We're not going to go through them all today. We're going to land the plane here. But we're going to talk about the first just for a second. Next week on Easter, we're going to talk about the rest. And I think, can I just say that I think we're going to, where we're landing with Colossians for Easter, I think is perfect for people who do not have a relationship with Christ. And can I just say, in years past, we've talked about, what kind of number we want to reach and how many people we want to have here on Easter. And as I've been thinking about that, and as we've been kind of working up to Easter and preparing for this next Sunday, the challenge for me this Sunday is not a number, but it's this. If you consider yourself to be a regular part of our church, my challenge to you is that everybody would invite somebody. That everybody would invite somebody. That this Easter, that we would go out and everybody would invite somebody. And if everybody does that, that's a win in my book. If all of us go out, whether those people accept the invitation or not. This last Friday, we mailed postcards out to the immediate neighbors of our church, the people in the communities right east, north, and west of us here. We mailed postcards out to them. And we've been talking this year about reaching your neighbors. Go talk to your neighbor and invite them to Easter. Why do we do this? Because of this first characteristic of someone who's in God's will. The second part of verse 10. He says, you live a life worthy of the Lord, pleasing him in every way. It says, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God. You see, knowing God's will isn't enough. We need to act on it. We need to live it out. We need to bear fruit in every good work. We need to reproduce, if you will. That's what bearing fruit is. It's multiplying. And the way we do that is by going out and loving the people that are around us. God is calling us to action. I don't want to live my life and get to the end of it and miss out on my divine calling. When I die and I meet Jesus, I want him to say, well done, good and faithful servant. I don't want him to say, well believed, good and faithful servant. I don't want him to say, hey, you knew my will. I'm glad you knew it. I want him to say, well done, Eric, good and faithful servant. I don't want him to say, that was an awfully nice temporary kingdom that you built up for yourself. That was a really nice straw house that you built throughout your life. No, I want to be able to get to the end and say, God, I have honored you with my life. I've lived for you. I've sacrificed. I've done the hard things to see you work. I want to work for the king. I want to be a builder for the kingdom. I don't want to build my own kingdom. I don't want to build my own life up. I want to build up God's plan, God's will, God's ways. And God has placed you in your particular circumstances for a reason. He wants to use you right where you are. Don't miss it. Don't go through life and just let it happen. Don't plan out your life so much that you crowd out God's plan for your life. Do good work now. God has placed you where you are to bear fruit in every good work. So do those good works now. Spend time seeking God's will now. It's never too late. Serve selflessly. Sacrifice and give now. See your circumstances as a chance to die and follow Jesus. It's not an easy message, but in doing that, we bring glory and honor to Christ. And that's what following God's will is all about. It's not about us. It's not about our own ways. I've got two responses for us today, as I typically do. And the first is for those who do not have a relationship with Jesus. And I want to encourage you today to choose to follow Jesus. You have a choice today if you're in the room. You have a choice to say, thy will be done or my will be done. Choose today to say, God, I want to do your will. God, I'm going to give my life to you. God, I'm going to surrender myself to you. If you're not a believer, if you don't have a relationship with Christ, I want to encourage you to do that today. And then second, for those of you who are believers in the room today, ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will. And I'm going to ask you to do this in a moment by coming forward and responding to the altar here. But I am begging you, I am encouraging you, I am imploring that you would do this every day on your own as well. We need a corporate altar, but you need a personal altar. You need a personal space where you seek God to say, God, here is my life. What would you do with it? I'm bringing myself in a place of sacrifice, offering myself to you. Take me and use me as you see fit. Do in me what you seek to accomplish. Because I believe that when we do that, yes, we will see fulfillment, but then God can take the little bits and pieces that we feel like are insignificant of our lives, and he can create something beautiful in us and through us. Would you pray with me?
It was our honor to play a small role in what God is doing in and through your life, and we would love to continue that journey with you. To find out what your next steps could be in your relationship with Christ, check out bethaltochurch.com/next. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you next time.